This is the fabled Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus came to this beautiful but lonely garden high on the Mount of Olives above the city of Jerusalem the night before his crucifixion. Below me is the old wall of the city, lighted by the lights of the city. In the center of it is the Eastern Gate, also called the Beautiful Gate, or the Golden Gate. It's located on the eastern wall. It's the only gate that leads directly into the temple area. In the year 1530 AD, it was bricked up by the Turks in an effort to keep Jesus from using the gate when he returns to earth on the Mount of Olives. The Muslims, knowing that a Jewish rabbi would never walk on a grave, buried many of their dead on the hillside right outside the Eastern Gate. That's also an effort to prevent Jesus from re-entering. The night before he was crucified, Jesus and his disciples had spent time in an upper room in Jerusalem. They had eaten the Passover supper, which consisted of roasted lamb and unleavened bread, bitter herbs, a cup of wine. He took the Passover bread and said, "This is my body, which is broken for you." And then a cup of wine. "This is the cup of the New Testament, my blood." Following that, he had picked up a basin and a towel, went to each one of his disciples, washed their feet. Then, after telling them that the Holy Spirit was coming in power, he led them out into the night. He probably left the city through the Essene Gate, passed through the Kidron Valley. Going by a vineyard, Jesus paused and said, "I am the vine and you're the branches." It was close to midnight when the small group arrived in this lovely place in the center of an old olive grove, the Garden of Gethsemane. Along the way, some other followers of Jesus had picked up and followed with them. Jesus asked the group to keep their eyes open. He expected trouble. He then withdrew to pray in solitaire, kneeling beside a great olive tree and sweating great drops of blood. Suddenly a commotion down below. Roman soldiers led by Judas, one of Jesus' disciples, had come to arrest him. The disciples who had fallen asleep were caught by surprise. Peter drew his sword and then was rebuked by Jesus. The rest all fled out into the night. It's at this point we meet young John Mark, who was a teenager. Mark had considered joining the Zealots, a militant group of activists who were trying to overthrow the Roman oppressors. And then he met Jesus. That night he had followed the crowd up here. It was an eerie scene. It was after midnight. The only lights came from the torches carried by the Romans and the light of the moon. Looming out of the night are these huge old olive trees with their gnarled trunks. Mark ducked behind an olive tree and watched. A soldier spotted him. Recalling that scene, Mark later wrote, "A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind." The story is sad. Here's a young fella. This is his first real spiritual confrontation, and he bombs out. He flunks the test. He fails. His failure haunts us all because very few people start right. Very few have everything go well from the beginning. Mark is like so many of us. His intentions were good, but when the chips were down, he ran. He was a coward. You know, it's tough to be a teenager. It's tough to go to school. It's tough to get started. The whole world is down on you. Sickness comes, drugs, alcohol. Your folks split, leave you on your own. Everybody bashes you around. It's hard to be a follower of Jesus. It's so much easier to run. When you think of John Mark and his failure, you think of all the children in life who've been told by their parents that they're failures. You know, of all the people who need to lift up kids, it ought to be parents. But it's the parents who are the first to say, "You'll never make it. You were born to be a failure." And after a while, the kid begins to believe it. When I think of John Mark, I think about all the times I've failed, the times I've let God down, despite all my grand intentions. How many times have I fled into the darkness rather than standing up for Jesus, fleeing for my life with guys rattling their sabers behind me? Mark was a deserter. He was a coward. Not only stripped of his garments, but stripped of his self-respect. He was a failure. But let me tell you something. Don't write off anyone who is a believer. Simply because a person has failed at some things does not mean that he's a failure. In fact, there's a difference between failing and being a failure. There's a difference between losing and being a loser. There's a difference between being afraid and being a coward. A coward is not someone who runs. A coward is someone who runs all the time. It was 15 years before we hear of Mark again. He shows up in Acts 13. 4 men had just left the coast of Israel, heading west on a ship across the Mediterranean Sea on the most significant journey in all of history. It was Paul's first missionary journey. Among the passengers were Paul, Barnabas, Luke, the physician, who had recorded the story in his journals called the Book of Acts, and John Mark. Mark is now 30 years old. They got as far as Pamphylia. Paul said it was time to head inland. We're going to go through the back regions of Turkey and up into the high hills, tablelands, to the cities of Asia Minor. It was going to be a tough trip. The country was filled with thieves who would cut your throat just to get your sandals. Mark, once again, backed down. He returned to Jerusalem. It was a huge disappointment to Barnabas, who had finally persuaded Paul to take Mark along. Later, on Paul's second missionary journey, Barnabas tried once again to convince Paul that Mark should come along. Barnabas was getting old. Paul was frail. They really needed a strong young man to help them out. But Paul said, Mark can't be counted on. There was a fierce argument between Paul and Barnabas over Mark, and they separated. Paul took Silas. Barnabas took Mark. Mark had lost out again, the third time. 10 more years passed. We hear nothing of John Mark. And then a letter makes the rounds of the various churches. It's from Simon Peter, who is also traveling as an apostle, establishing churches. And Peter closes his first letter by saying, the churches send their greetings, as does my son, Mark. Barnabas had picked him up after his third failure at age 32 and had given him another chance. Now he's traveling with Peter. If anyone understands failure, it's Peter. You know, he too was here at Gethsemane. You remember that night when Jesus asked his disciples to watch and pray? Peter couldn't keep his eyes open, and he went to sleep. The soldiers surprised them. Worse than that, he was outside the courthouse that night, denying he ever knew Jesus. Let Paul seek perfection. Peter would pick up John Mark. But wait just a minute. There's one more reference to Mark in the Bible. Many years later, Paul was writing from his prison cell in Rome. He's old now and about to lose his head to the Romans for following Jesus. And he writes his last letter to Timothy, who's the pastor at Ephesus. And he says, do your best to come to me quickly. For Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me, and he's gone to Thessalonica. Only Luke is with me. All of Paul's friends have deserted him. And then he concludes his letter, get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to my ministry. Here's old Paul, the one who judged Mark, wiped him out, the one who had pegged him as a loser, a coward. But at the end of Paul's life, he says, you know, this fellow Mark really has what it takes. I'd really like for you to get him and bring him to me, because he's very helpful to me in my ministry. Who was Mark? He was the first one to sit down and write the life of Jesus. His book occupies slot number 2 in the New Testament. Babe Ruth, they say, struck out 1,330 times. He still holds the record as the strikeout king in baseball. No baseball player ever failed more than Babe Ruth. But who cares? All history remembers is that he was the first man to hit 60 home runs in one season. As you study John Mark in your workbooks, I'd like for you to remember something that my dad used to say to me. I don't care if you lose. Just never be a quitter. You see, when God's at work in your life, there's no such thing as losing. In short, it ain't over till the fat lady sings. Losers can be winners too.